These scientists found a plane buried in Arctic ice. What they found inside is unbelievable. It was a bitterly cold day in the Arctic, and Dr. Landon and his crew stumbled upon something they had only heard about in legends. They couldn't believe they had actually found it after all this time. In front of them was a massive aircraft that was frozen in time and partially buried in thick ice. The plane had been lost for years, along with the many passengers who were on board. No one ever thought it would be found, much less in this frozen landscape. A smile spread over Dr. Landon's face. They had been right in their predictions. But, as the scientists stood in front of the plane, their initial excitement faded slightly. Something strange caught their attention as they studied the wreckage. One of the scientists swore he saw movement inside the plane, as if something, or someone, was inside. It didn't make sense. There was no way anyone could have survived this long, not in the brutal cold of the Arctic. Yet the shadow seemed real enough, and the scientists' mood shifted quickly from excitement to fear. Their leader was Dr. Jeremy Landon, and he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into danger. Yet Landon was a stubborn man. He told himself it was just nerves and decided to press on. After all, the plane had been missing for years, and it was important to document every detail. The plane itself was a passenger aircraft that had mysteriously vanished during a flight over the northern skies many years ago. It had been flying from Lisbon to North America, carrying over 100 passengers, when it disappeared. No one had ever found any wreckage, no sign of the passengers, and no clue as to what had happened. Search parties had been sent out, and investigators had tried for years to figure out what happened. But the plane was never found. Over time, people started to believe it was just another one of those unsolved mysteries of the world, until now. The aircraft that had become the subject of countless stories had finally been uncovered by Dr. Landon and his crew. Dr. Landon had been planning this expedition for months. His team had combed through old reports, followed up on leads, and spent countless hours preparing for what they thought would be an exciting but straightforward discovery mission. When they finally received permission from the Canadian government to explore the remote Arctic region, the team was elated. It wasn't easy getting permission to venture into such a remote and dangerous area, but Dr. Landon and his crew of scientists were not just experts. They had all the right connections to make it happen. Before leaving, the team underwent extensive preparation. They gathered the best cold weather gear, survival equipment, and research tools. The crew was a mix of experts, but mostly scientists, trackers, and a boat pilot, all handpicked by Dr. Landon for their skills. They knew the conditions would be harsh, but they were ready. They spent hours poring over satellite images and previous data, carefully calculating their route and making sure they were equipped to handle anything the Arctic threw at them. Finally, the day arrived. The scientists loaded their supplies and set off. They were thrilled to finally have a chance to solve the mystery once and for all. After a long journey, the crew's boat arrived at the Arctic, where the frigid temperatures welcomed them. It was colder than anything most of them had ever experienced. Their breath came out in thick clouds, and frost clung to their jackets. As they neared where they believed the crash site was, they could see the vast icy landscape stretching out before them. The temperature was brutal, and it seemed impossible that anything could survive out here. Yet their prize was there. In the distance, they could make out the large shape of the plane, which was barely visible through the haze of snow and ice. The team was thrilled. Their hard work had paid off. As the crew began setting up equipment to document their discovery, they took several photos of the airplane from the boat. The plane was wedged into a massive block of ice in the frozen valley, and its fuselage was sticking out at an odd angle. The aircraft was clearly in bad shape. Its hull was torn open in places, and debris was scattered around the surrounding area. Yet despite the damage, the plane had been perfectly preserved by the ice. It hadn't splintered to 1,000,000 pieces as they had expected. It was as if the wreckage had been waiting all these years to be discovered. The ice in the remote valley had preserved the plane perfectly, keeping the wreckage intact. It was almost too good to be true. The crew buzzed with excitement as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. How had the plane ended up in such an inaccessible place? The scientists had different theories. Some believed the weather had played a role in the crash, while others speculated that mechanical failure could have been to blame. No one could say for sure. Yet as they stood there, snapping photos and discussing the possibilities, they remained totally unaware of the darker truth hiding just beneath the surface. To make the exploration more efficient, Dr. Landon made a quick decision to split the crew. Half of the team stayed on the boat to monitor the ice, while the other half, led by Dr. Landon, headed out to the crash site. The ice looked stable enough, but the Arctic was an unpredictable place, and they didn't want to take unnecessary risks. So Dr. Landon took his group, and they began the journey across the ice, moving carefully toward the plane. Back on the boat, one of the scientists had been reviewing the photos they had taken earlier. To her surprise, she noticed something strange in one of the images. At first, the scientists thought it was just a glare or a reflection, but the more she looked at it, the more it disturbed her. It looked like there was something, or someone there. The outline was faint, but there was definitely something standing in the shadow of the wreckage. The scientist quickly showed the other crew members on the boat, and their former excitement turned into concern. Meanwhile, Dr. Landon and his team were closing in on the crash site. The cold stung their faces, and the snow crunched under their boots as they walked. Even though they were well prepared, the freezing air still made each breath feel heavy. But their prize was right in front of them. They could see the outline of the plane more clearly now. Its metal frame had been battered by the crash, with parts of the hull torn open and debris scattered around. Around the plane and inside of it, they could see that the cold had preserved everything, even the bodies of the passengers. It was a truly disturbing sight as the mummified remains of some of the passengers sat frozen in their seats, wearing the same clothes they had been in when the plane went down. The personal belongings of the passengers, from bags to books, were still intact, although they were now encased in the ice. It was like the scientists stepped into a frozen graveyard. As they moved through the wreckage, one of the scientists took another photo of the plane. When he reviewed this photo, he found something truly unsettling. There in the photo was a shadowy figure, as if it were watching them. The scientist passed the photo around, and everyone, including Dr. Landon, looked at it. There was something inside the plane watching them. But what? Dr. Landon wasn't ready to give in to fear. He brushed off the concerns and told the crew that it was nothing but a trick of the light. They had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let superstition stop them. Joseph Julius was an aeronautical researcher, which made him the aircraft expert among the scientists. As he studied the damage to the plane, he was quick to realize this was not a simple crash. There were signs that the plane had suffered engine trouble, likely caused by the extreme weather. He theorized that a storm had knocked the plane off course, and the freezing temperatures had caused mechanical failures that brought it down. But as he continued to examine the wreck, his mind kept returning to the strange figure seen in the photos. Was it real? Could someone have survived? The very idea seemed impossible. As Dr. Landon and his crew continued exploring the frozen plane, something felt off. The discovery of the shadowy figure in the photograph still lingered in their minds, but now something else had caught their attention. Their tracker, Emily Jonas, had noticed deep gashes inside the plane. It was the kind of marks that looked too deliberate to have been caused by the crash. She stepped outside to inspect the area more closely, and then spotted something that made her heart skip a beat. There were fresh tracks in the snow. The tracks circled the plane before leading away into the ice. Emily pointed at the tracks and shook her head in confusion. Who or what made these? She wondered aloud. The rest of the crew came over and their eyes went wide with disbelief. They had seen pictures showing that something had been in the plane before they went in, and now these tracks were showing that whatever it was had left. It didn't make sense. Nothing was supposed to survive out here, especially not this far north in such freezing temperatures. Still, Dr. Landon was not cowed. He tried to shake off the strange feeling that was creeping up on him by turning his attention back to the plane. He headed into the plane to the frozen cockpit, where he noticed the door was jammed. It had been completely sealed shut by layers of ice. As night began to fall, the cold grew even more intense, and the crew's morale started to drop. They were tired, hungry, and honestly unnerved by the strange discoveries they were seeing. The scientists suggested heading back to the boat for the night, but Dr. Landon wasn't ready to leave yet. The discovery of the plane had consumed him, and he wanted to learn more before calling it a day. The rest of the crew, however, was growing uneasy, and not just because of the cold. They had started noticing and hearing strange sounds like movements and faint whispers. It was as if something was out there with them. Every now and then someone would stop, claiming they saw a figure moving in the distance, only for it to vanish moments later. Dr. Landon tried to stay calm and logical, but when he counted the mummified bodies of the passengers, he realized something unsettling. 5 of the bodies out of the passengers in the flight manifest were missing. Where had they gone? Had animals dragged them away? Landon saw that as impossible, as nothing could survive in such conditions. Had something else happened? Though he knew it was impossible for anything to survive out here, the strange sounds and the missing bodies left him with an unsettling feeling. Dr. Landon was more than determined to get to the bottom of it, so he made a risky decision. He divided the crew into pairs and sent them to search for the source of the noises they kept hearing. Emily and Joseph moved toward the rear of the plane, while Drs. Landon and Alice Neville, the team's medic, headed toward the cockpit. As they approached the cockpit once more, Dr. Alice stopped suddenly. "There are sounds coming from in there," she said in a tense voice. Dr. Landon listened carefully and heard it too, a faint rustling, as if something was shifting inside the sealed-off space. He grabbed an axe from the tools they had brought along and forced the frozen door open, yet they found nothing that could be said to be causing the sounds. The cockpit instruments were locked in place, and the clock inside the plane stood frozen at exactly 3:47 p.m. The crash had happened at that very moment, and time had stood still ever since. In the corner, Dr. Landon spotted something important: the plane's black box. That would be the key to unlocking the mystery of what really happened to the flight. He carefully pulled it out of the controls section, knowing that the answers they were seeking could be stored inside. With that, the scientists decided it was time to return to the boat. The cold was becoming unbearable, and the strange atmosphere around the plane wasn't helping anyone's nerves. "Back on the boat, Doctor." Landon immediately got to work. He tried to recover the data from the black box to find out the real cause of the plane crash and who or what was roaming around the crash site. Using custom-built tools and advanced software, the scientists worked to extract the critical information hidden inside the damaged device. But before they could make any progress, a sudden shout came from one of the crew members. "Look, over there!" he yelled, pointing toward the crash site. Everyone rushed to the side of the boat and looked in the direction of the plane. In the distance, just visible through the ice and snow, was a white figure. It was standing still, barely noticeable, but it was there. For a few brief moments, they all saw it. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the mist. The crew was shaken as they were unsure of what they had just witnessed. Had it been another trick of the light? Or was there something more to the strange events surrounding the crash site? By the next day, Dr. Landon still couldn't shake the creeping feeling from the previous night. The image of the white figure standing near the plane stayed in his mind, as well as the fresh marks on the ice surrounding the wreckage only made him more uneasy. He felt certain that something, or someone, had been living around the plane. Despite his crew's warnings and advice to stay cautious, Dr. Landon made up his mind. They needed to investigate further. There was more to the story of this frozen plane, and he wouldn't leave without understanding what was happening. With that, Landon and the crew headed back to the wrecked plane. As they moved closer to the wreckage, the crew found something unexpected. There were a new set of tracks in the snow. These tracks didn't belong to any of them, nor did they resemble the marks left by a single person. It looked like some people had been wandering around aimlessly. The tracks led away from the plane and toward a nearby cave that they hadn't noticed earlier. Dr. Landon gathered his team together and shared his plan. They would follow the tracks and explore the cave. Whatever was making the strange noises and leaving the marks might be inside. The crew was stunned by Landon's bold instructions, but when they saw he meant business, they agreed. Armed with headlamps and lanterns, the crew ventured into the dark cave. But to their surprise, the deeper they went, the warmer the cave seemed to get. After walking for a while, the scientists stumbled upon something unusual. Scattered around the cave were remnants of survival. There was a tattered journal, old blankets, and bits of food. These items had clearly been left behind by someone. Joseph began flipping through the fragile pages of the journal and read some parts out loud. It told a sad and horrifying story. The plane had crashed, but half of the passengers and crew had initially survived the impact. However, the extreme cold of the Arctic eventually claimed them one by one. Their final days had been recorded in heartbreaking detail, but the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As they ventured further into the cave, the scientists made a chilling discovery. They found 5 bodies. They were the missing passengers from the plane, and it was clear they hadn't made it. The sight was heartbreaking, as their frozen faces reflected the agony they must have gone through in their final moments. This discovery made it obvious that all of the passengers were dead. Yet the strange sounds and tracks suggested that something, or someone, was still moving around outside. But who, if not the passengers, had been making all the noise and leaving the tracks? Suddenly, as they reached the deepest part of the cave, they discovered the answer. What they found inside was something both unexpected and unbelievable. They saw a massive polar bear standing in the shadows of the cavern and staring back at them with piercing eyes. Beside the bear were 2 young cubs that were nestled in the ice. The explorers froze in place as they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The polar bear didn't attack or growl. She simply looked at them with confusion and caution. In that moment, everything clicked for Dr. Landon. The bear was behind all the strange events they had experienced, the scratches, the noises, the movements in the distance. It wasn't a ghost or something supernatural. It was this bear that was protecting her cubs and trying to survive in the same harsh environment the plane had crashed in. Dr. Landon quickly signaled to his team to retreat. They moved slowly and quietly as they did not want to startle the bear or give her any reason to feel threatened. Every step they took was cautious, and their hearts pounded in fear as they inched their way back toward the cave's entrance. After what felt like an eternity, the team finally made it outside. They breathed a huge sigh of relief as they had narrowly avoided a dangerous encounter. Once they were safely outside, Dr. Landon's mind raced. He knew polar bears lived in harsh conditions, but this was extreme even for them. The Arctic was a brutal environment, yet this mother bear and her cubs had not only survived, but seemed to be thriving. Dr. Landon became even more in awe of the natural world and how wildlife could adapt in ways that humans could barely understand. The bear's thick fur and layers of fat, as well as her hunting instincts, had kept her alive, even when everything around her was frozen and unforgiving. Back on the boat, the crew began piecing together everything they had learned. They analyzed the data they had gathered and reviewed photos and notes. As they zoomed in on the photos they had taken throughout the expedition, one thing became clear. The polar bear had been watching them all along. Even the white figure they had seen the night before was the bear, standing in the snow and observing them. She had found a way to survive, even in the harshest conditions imaginable. Dr. Landon then turned his attention to the plane's black box, which they had recovered from the cockpit. The team had extracted the data, and as the audio recording played through the speakers, the touching story of the plane's final moments became clear. The recording captured the pilot's desperate attempts to regain control as the plane hit severe turbulence. The technical failures that followed sealed the plane's fate, and the recording ended with frantic calls for help, which abruptly cut off as the plane crashed into the icy valley. The survivors had tried to fight against the elements, but in the end, the unforgiving cold had claimed them one by one. Listening to the black box recording gave the scientists a clearer understanding of what had happened, but it also left them with a heavy sense of sadness. The passengers had suffered a tragic fate, and their remains had been locked in ice for decades. With their mission accomplished, it was time to head home and let the Canadian authorities handle the rest. As the ship's horn sounded, Dr. Landon looked out at the frozen landscape one last time. He and his crew had achieved the impossible and uncovered secrets buried for decades. The wrecked plane, the frozen passengers, and the polar bear were all pieces of a puzzle that now made sense. As they sailed away, Dr. Landon knew that this expedition had changed them all, Nature had shown its power, and they would carry this experience with them for the rest of their lives. Dr. Landon, in particular, knew he would never forget the mysteries they had uncovered in the frozen Arctic.